the next stage of the government's major welfare reform program. As you know, the National League government has had a very strong focus on welfare over the past 3.5 years. We believe that those who can work should work, and will help them to do just that. Delivering better public services is one of the National League government's 4 key priorities for our second term, and welfare reform is a significant component of this. We've introduced a number of changes to benefits in 2010 which are already having positive effects. The future focus changes include the requirement that those receiving the unemployment benefit reapply for it after 1 year. That simple change has seen 12,500 people cancel their benefit, saving $17 million. Of that number, more than half didn't even complete the application, and more than 3,300 had already found a job. What this shows is that a more active approach to welfare has the potential to achieve positive results. With that in mind, last November we announced a comprehensive reform of the benefits system, building off the recommendations of the Welfare Working Group. The reforms we are undertaking is so comprehensive that Cabinet has agreed we will action it in 2 stages. It will be implemented over 2 years to improve the way help is delivered to those in genuine need. I think it's clear to almost everyone the current benefit system is simply not working and not delivering for New Zealand. 351,000 people, or 13% of New Zealand's working age population, are on a benefit, while 220,000 children live in benefit-dependent homes. This is creating too many vulnerable people and trapping them into a life of limited choices, poverty and poor health. Evidence clearly shows children are better off when their parents are in work and not on welfare. Social Development Minister Paula Bennett will go through some of the finer details of the next stage of our program in a moment. But first I want to give you an outline of what's happening. Next month, the first of 2 bills to bring our welfare reform policies into action will be introduced to the House. The first bill will broadly do 2 things. Firstly, it will make significant changes for young people aged 16 to 18, including teen parents. And it will also put work obligations on beneficiaries with children, as well as those on widows and women's alone benefits. I'm going to talk now about the youth component of the changes, and after that Paula will talk more about the wider work obligations for beneficiaries. Young people aged 16 to 17 and teen parents up to 18 years of age will no longer be given a benefit check and left to their own devices. From July, we will be funding providers to work alongside these young people to make sure that they are in education, training or work. We will also help them to make decisions that will put them on a path to employment and take them off the fast track to a life on welfare. We will help them get re-engaged in education, and we will help them to learn to manage their finances better and make good life decisions. Most young people will be required to be in education, training or work-based learning in order to receive either a new youth payment or a new young parent payment. These will replace the current youth benefits. Some of the basic costs for a young person, like rent and power, will be paid directly to suppliers, and living costs like groceries will be loaded onto a payment card that cannot be used to purchase alcohol and cigarettes. A small in-hand allowance will also be paid direct to that young person. Another new approach we will take with these young people is that we're going to reward them when they make good decisions. For example, teen parents will receive an extra $10 per week when they complete a parenting course. Young people will be able to receive an extra $10 a week if they complete a budgeting course. Likewise, after 6 months of good attendance at school or education, they'll get an extra $10 a week, although these payments could be taken away from a young person if they go off the tracks. That means young people could potentially be getting an extra $20 to $30 a week for making good decisions. Changes around young people, including teen parents, will be phased in from 30th of July this year. Stage 2 of our welfare reform will see benefit categories overhauled to ensure that those who can work, do work. There will also be measures to clamp down on welfare fraud. I strongly believe we need a benefit system that focuses on what people can do rather than what they can't do. That challenges people, not treats them as passive recipients of benefits, and it provides support, training and opportunities for people to return to the workforce. That's what our package of reforms is all about, and I make no apology for wanting New Zealand to be a country of work, enterprise and self-reliance. I'd also like to reiterate there won't be any cuts to main benefit rates in our reforms, and these rates will continue to be adjusted for inflation. Our welfare reform program is about making a much more active and investment-focused benefit system. I'd now like to hand over to the Minister. She'll take through some details and then we'll take any questions
Thank you, Prime Minister. I suppose I'd like to make the point that we are fundamentally changing the welfare system. So by the time we get to the end of this reform process, you will see a very different welfare system. The welfare system was created in 1935 and was enacted in the 1960s. The reality is that we need to move into a modern New Zealand and modernise the system so that it's ready for 2012 and going forward. And that's what you will see. Social norms have changed, so has people's needs, so has technology, and we simply have an obligation to make sure that we're keeping up with that and getting a system that actually works for the people of New Zealand. Underpinning the whole system will be the investment approach, of which you will see more details in the second stage of these reforms next year. But we've talked about it before, and I just want to reiterate it being really the fundamental approach to how we move forward on welfare. So that's looking at that long-term liability. It is by changing the way of who we work with and whom we spend money on. And to give you an example, really those on an unemployment benefit are effectively only about 10% of the long-term liability, so those who are most likely to cost the most and stay the longest. However, we spend about 90% of our spend on them, and we simply have to change it. So a big part of what I'm talking about today on the basis and on that of what the Prime Minister talked about with the youth payments and the changes to them are some of those changes to those on the DPV and changes to those with children. So we are introducing more support for sole parents than ever before. The average duration on the DPV is 7 to 10 years, and the DPV costs taxpayers around $5 million a day. Currently, in those differences, the changes that we made 2 years ago, we had the part-time work test for those who had the youngest child at 6 years old. We're taking that back to 5 years old. So a woman on the DPV or a man on the DPV will now be part-time work tested when the youngest is 5, and there will now for the first time be a full-time work test when the youngest is 14 years. That will affect around 11,000 people will now be full-time work tested, so they have children 14 years or over. And the whole changes made to the widows and the women's alone and the DPV will see changes for about 30,000 on that. So that is adding on from the fundamental changes that we made in 2010, now bringing that back to part-time work testing at 5 years old and a third full-time work test when that youngest is 14. Alongside that changes to widows and women alone. The reality is that men can't get them. The widow's benefit was introduced in 1911, so here we are more than 100 years later, so it just makes sense that we bring that in line as well. So there will be, we expect those people to be available for work depending on the age of their children or if they have children. So those that do not have children will be part-time, will be work tested full-time. Those that have children, depending on the age, will be in line with the DPV. Though these will be brought into effect in October. So the changes that the Prime Minister mentioned, as he said, were July. The changes to the DPV and the widows and women alone will be brought in October. We'll see a second bill coming through in about August this year, with those changes really being implemented in 2013.
Well, picking up on the change of the widow, we really did sort of here because, you know, you can imagine someone, their spouse dies, a month later hits the age of which they get work tested, go back to work full time, and they're still going through the, I mean, do you have any?
Yeah. So to start with, there will be a time for people to kind of readjust to new circumstances. We do that certainly around domestic violence as well, and people that are getting out of some relationships, they need some time to adjust to the new circumstances. So that will be recognised, so it may not be immediate, and in some cases will take a few months and there'll be some flexibility in that. as I say, it does also depend on the age of the children. Also, though, that investment approach is quite going to determine whom they work with and how and how much. And so it would kind of depend on, at times, sort of the work experience they've got, the age and everything else as to what they do.
Will the investment approach mean more money? Because one of the reasons why so much money is spent on those on the unemployment benefits, I guess it's a bit like triage. They're the easiest ones to deal with and the quickest ones to get back to work. The approach you're taking, presumably, is to deal with people who are more difficult to get back to work and will take more time, more investment, presumably.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So ultimately what we do is you would argue that there will be some that we spend a lot of time and a lot of money on that would have gone back into work themselves anyway of their own means, and others that we're spending nothing on and are getting no support and none of the benefits of actually having external agencies work with them and the eustress that come with that. So we will be, the investment approach will look at how and who they spend it on, and it can look quite different over a period of time. You'll also see them trialling some stuff. So you will have them working on something and really evaluating whether it works, whether it moves them off, and whether it's the right way to go. And it's kind of at a macro, a cohort, and an individual level, if you like.
But are you budgeting to spend more money?
Yes, we are. So, at the moment we're saying more than $130 million a year is the kind of spend by the time you get to the end of these reforms, and it's projected to have a sort of $1 billion saving over 4 years.
How much is the allowance for people, the in-hand allowance?
It depends on their circumstances. So at the moment, the independent youth benefit, so the IYB, is around sort of $200 a week. So depending on what their board is. So for some, for example, their food, their board, their power, their everything will actually be encompassed in that payment. So you would have some on an in-hand allowance and some on a card, but probably more on the in-hand in other cases. But the sort of maximum around that in-hand allowance is $50 a week.
How many needs do you expect to be targeted by the $10 a week payment?
Yeah.
How many of them do you expect to take it up?
Look, we think they will, because also remembering the whole thing with the youth package is that they're going to be really connected to a social service provider. So, for example, that young person comes in and says, I want to go on a benefit, or that young person is just found to be not engaged in education or training or employment. First thing we're going to do is attach them to an external provider like the Salvation, for example, the Salvation Army, for example, or one of your local iwi trusts or something like that. They will then go through a budget with that young person, and we'll talk about the expectations coming up. And they would also get a payment, a milestone achievement payment, if that young person achieves finishes a budgeting course or a parenting course. So that's quite an incentive for them to walk them through the process.
But, how many of them do you think, how many people do you think will take these?
Yeah, well, we've costed it, and the cost, if the sort of numbers that we think will, then we think they see the cost of being about an extra $3.8 million a year. There's 3,000 both teen parents and those on the IYB, and sort of a reasonable percentage of them take it up over time, and that's kind of cost.
It says in here that sole parents with young children and those on the supported living payment will be eligible for a financial incentive if they decide to take up work earlier than expectations require them to. What are those expectations?
Yeah, I'm delighted with this one. So Cabinet has agreed that actually for those that outside of the work expectations, if they take up full-time work, they can keep their benefit being reduced by $100 a week. And that's just recognising that move of going from benefit and into work can be pretty stressful, and you've got additional costs. You've got to think about travel, you've got sort of different things. So we're actually graduating them losing their benefit over by losing it by $100 a week instead of an instant losing it.
What are the expectations?
So that's if they go into full-time work outside of the work test period. So, at the moment the full-time work test, well, with the changes we're making, will be when the youngest is 14. If they go into full-time work out of that, they can actually lose their benefit graduated instead of an instant loss.
Isn't all this going to depend on the economy and how many jobs are there? Because, over the 9 years of previous Labor government, they knocked about 140,000 off benefits, essentially on the back of economic growth and more jobs. If there are no jobs, whatever changes you make to the welfare system will make no real difference.
For SALIP, there's all the economic forecasters are predicting strength and growth in the labour markets. So it's going to be new jobs. The economy, or the best information we have, doesn't have a really big look at Treasury's forecast there, Reserve Bank or private sector economists, that's best. Second thing is, look, I think you saw over that period of time, you're right, there was volatility and a reduction overall in the number of people on unemployment benefit, but there was also an increase in those other benefit categories. And so, as the Minister said, that's really one of the big areas of focus and attention. But you're right, I mean, in the end, people have to find we're simply making them that we work available at the end of the day. The jobs aren't there, they'll continue to enjoy their benefits. But the emphasis has got to be, I think, on the economy which creates work and creates jobs. I think there are jobs out there. We constantly see that through our working income officers that are registering 1,000, 2,000 jobs a week. So there are jobs there. But we need to make sure those people who are currently on benefits, some of them are reskilled and retrained so that they can take advantage. Sometimes it's just confidence. They're out of the workforce for a period of time. It's hard for them to get back and get a job. There's need some encouragement to do that.
Have you set the rates for the successful incentive fees for the private providers?
No, we're currently, we're just about to start the RFP process for that. But I think this is really important. So this is where we're going to be working with sort of up to 14,000 young people with those service providers, because it's not just those that are on benefit, it's also those that are not engaged in employment or training. For some, we will be paying a very minimal amount. Quite frankly, they are not hugely at risk and perhaps just need a little bit of a push in the right direction, or they're just sort of slightly lost. Others have pretty complex needs, whether that be around a sort of a family history of wealthy dependence, a history of a child using family drug and alcohol, and they are going to be more expensive and need a lot more time and a lot more investment. So it's going to look quite different. So for some, you could be spending $500, for others you could be spending $7,000 a month.
So the Treasury brought up concerns about the robustness of that system, the contracting and the general sort of setup. Can you reassure people that that is going to be a robust system for giving out those contracts and for following it up later on?
So where Treasury had it wrong was they presumed that the providers themselves were going to be deciding who was at risk and who was not and what level of. They won't be doing that. So fundamental changes, part of these changes is that they're going to be changing laws so that school have to report in real time when kids are not there, when they've dropped out and when they are no longer engaged. We're then going to combine that with the information that we hold on them through the Ministry of Social Development, which at times is pretty significant. We know if there's a history of wealthy dependents in the household, if there's a history of child and family, we know if they live in state housing, we actually know and can get quite a big picture. The school will tell us about what your attendance has been like and what your records. Once you pull all that together, you can actually see a much clearer picture of whom is at risk and who is not. And we will incentivise the provider with milestone payments like I've described that get them with the kind of outcomes that we want for these kids.
So how do you stop someone being, having a contract and saying, $14,000, that person getting a contract and sort of carrying on and receiving payments, or carrying on with that into the future?
Well, for a start, they're going to get an administration fee up front, and then as that young person reaches milestones, they will get a further payment from the department. So it's not like they're just getting regular payments no matter what happens. It will be paid based on actual and real outcomes following that individual child or young person, and that's going to be the big difference. But I actually think there's pretty amazing organisations that are working with these young people for all the right reasons. If we collect data better, if we give them more information on them, then we're very confident that we can have different outcomes for them.
Did you let Treasury know they were wrong?
One would presume I did. And have. Oh look, that's an old paper as well. It was back in April last year, and so here we are, sort of 10 months later. But we worked our way through it, and certainly are pretty excited about the next stage of these reforms.
And so the last household labour force survey put the NEET rate for 15 to 24-year-olds at 13%. Do you have a target you'd like to see it come down to, at the time frame for that?
Yeah, I mean, we're blatantly targeting 16 and 17-year-olds, and for all the right reasons. I mean, when you look at them, 90% of those NEET will go on a benefit when they turn 18. So if you're looking at A, who's on benefit the longest, who has the the highest risk of being there and actually seeing that intergenerational welfare dependence, it is those young people. So we're blatantly targeting that sort of up to 14,000, and that's how you kind of stop that sort of chain that leads to them being still meted at 21, 22.
But you have a figure you'd like to see that 13% drop to?
Oh look, I think we always want it to be significantly lower, but no, I don't have a particular number in mind that we're working towards.
Are there specific training courses that wouldn't be exceptions? Have you got a list of would and wouldn't?
Oh, I think we're still working our way through that process with the RFP and working with the provider. So without a doubt, we've got clear focus on it being that we're getting these kids, these youth in particular, work ready and work available. So it would have to be in line with that.
So you want to get 46,000 t-shirts off, is that, I mean, what's the time period for that?
So we've seen the projections that have been done tell us up to 46,000 over 4 years, plus another 11,000 in part-time work, and that's on top of the kind of Treasury predictions of 20,000 just because of the economy and the jobs that become available. So those are the kind of figures we're seeing over 4 years, which are the projections that we've been looking to.
Sorry, man, just the 14,000, is that what you're targeting the cash incentive act that you're hoping that it could reach up to 14,000 needs?
We'll work with 14,000 through our service providers, and of them 3,000 on benefit, and will be eligible for the payment card and the incentive payments.
It's a big group that aren't on benefit. They're not in work, they're not in training, they're not at school, but we know they're on a collision course with the benefit.
So that's the 3,000.
That's the 11,000, the other 3,000 already on benefit because their personal circumstances have taken that.
Is it realistic to expect that you're going to get actually over 11,000 and then it's going to slip through?
Well, the reality is right now that most of them are slipping through because we're not sharing information in real time, because we're not wrapping the right kind of support around them. So, when we've looked at the type of models that there are, then we think this will work with better information sharing in our smaller towns. And, you see it in the sort of Oklahoma model and how it works. So we've taken some of the best of that and extended it out and actually got education and Wednesday on board. So.
Then the privacy of all the rights and sensitivity about information sharing like that between ANC and the Ministry of Education?
Yeah, well look, Cabinet's approved the Cabinet papers and we're currently writing the legislation with all of that kind of in mind. I mean, the one thing I would say is that the whole system's kind of discriminatory. It sort of works with people based on their age and whether they've got children or not and everything else. So, but there are issues that we different.
This talks about a new way of assessing people who are now on the sickness and invalid benefits. Does that signal what's happening on those people and how is that all going to work?
So that's coming up in the next stage of the reforms that you'll see later this year. But as we kind of indicated, those on the invalid's benefit will be moving into, we're just giving it a different category, but the same criteria will be used. We announced that last year, so there's not sort of huge changes for those on the invalids. However, sickness could look quite different. So those on the sickness benefit will eventually merge with a job seeker and will just be temporarily exempt from work for a time while they're unable to work.
And what about people who are caring for the elderly or children with disabilities? Will there be more stringent tests on therapy?
Well, we announced that last year as well in our welfare reforms, and once we get into the sort of detail of that, we're moving through, but we do see those that are on the DBV caring for the sick or infirm moving on to the supported living payment, and being able to support them through that.
And you're also talking here about a childcare payment. Is that extra on what they already get? Is that going to be more support to help people?
Yes, it will, particularly for those teen parents. We're asking a lot of teen parents, and I think that it can be pretty scary to bring your baby and you are young and you're trying to struggle. So we want to wrap real support around them with a private provider. So with someone in the community, whether it be ED-based or whether it be a community organisation. And we see ourselves wrapping it around them and then having substantially more support, both in help with early childcare education and your own education themselves. So yes.
So does that involve basically a payment of full-time, 40-hour-a-week childcare?
Yes, it could. Actually, it could actually be a little more than that by the time you put in travel and that sort of thing for them.
Okay, so basically it's a bit...
Sorry, 60,000 people on the sickness benefit. Does that mean that they are all going to talk to the regulars as they go on to the job seeker?
That will be coming through in the next stage of our reform, so it's not part of the ones that we're announcing today. So that will be coming through in more detail in that one.
So, I mean, the basic message I think is very clear, which is I don't think the current system we've got is sustainable. It's a system that was based on mutual obligation. The system. If you go and have a look at other OECD countries, New Zealand has very low levels of work testing and work requirements. And when you've got a system which is costing the better part of $20 million a day, $8 billion a year, and supporting 351,000 New Zealanders of working age, then I think you've got a system that's not working and functioning properly. In fact, it's costing the taxpayers a lot of money, but it's also not delivering good outcomes for those who are on. And we are determined to make change in a way which is beneficial for individuals, which supports them and invests in them, but ultimately sees these people on benefits.
Do you think employers are willing to take these people on?
Yeah, I do. Look, over time they will, as the labour markets tighten up and when they have training. A lot of people, these people actually want to genuinely get in work. I mean, I'm out and about every week. I get lots of people come up and say that they're on sickness benefit or they're unemployed and they're on a job. And I think this is all about trying to make sure that we make people work ready and able to carry out those employments.
You can talk about jobs being out there. What sort of jobs? Is there one area that is a lot of work available?
Well, there's a big range, isn't there? I mean, at any one time you see a huge number of jobs advertised over the economy. And we need to help people through that and need to have an efficient economy which creates those jobs.
What are they? Jobs that people are talking about?
Well, it's certainly going to be better than what someone's earning on a benefit. Because at the end of the day, their benefit payments substantially lower than paid employment. And if you go and look at the increased payments that people then get through working payments and their indirect tax credit, when you look at the overall contribution that the income that they get in the household, what we do know is when we look at the analysis of youngsters in New Zealand that are living in conditions defined in the first world as being in poverty, they're almost exclusively coming from welfare-based homes.
Have you looked at two waves of reform in the 90s in relation to sickness and invalidity benefits where you did sort of work testing, tightened up on going to jobs, the requirement to be ready for work, and it had no effect on the numbers, they kept on going up.
Well, I didn't specifically look at those, but I'm confident over time, as we saw with Future Focus, where there's a change in emphasis in the system, you'll get different outcomes. And I'm confident you're going to see that. But that's our job as a government to try and work through that system. But we've seen it with ACC as well. Again, when a slight change in emphasis in the system allowed us to deliver, I think, a better system. And in the end, this is a system that all New Zealanders at some point might rely on. So the confidence New Zealanders need to have is that this system is going to be there for them on the day they might need it. And the current system is on a pathway, in my view, to not being economically sustainable.